In the early hours of Monday, July 1st, 2024, at Chestnut Spinney, a residential area in Droitwich Spa, Worcestershire, most families were still asleep when emergency services received a call from a house in the neighborhood. The caller was 42-year-old Mohammed Samak. He reported that his wife, 49-year-old Joanne Samak, had inflicted injuries upon herself. Shortly thereafter, police and medical personnel arrived at the scene. Joanne was found in critical condition. Emergency efforts to save her proved unsuccessful. Joanne was pronounced dead at the home she shared with her family. At first glance, the explanation seemed straightforward. A woman had died following an act of self-harm. Her husband was the one who had called for help. However, the process of gathering statements quickly revealed a detail that was difficult to explain. Neighbors reported hearing screaming coming from the house more than an hour before the 999 call was made. That timeline immediately became crucial. If Joanne had been in danger earlier, why was help summoned only after such a long delay? What had transpired inside the Chestnut Spinney home during that unexplained interval? And more importantly, would the story Mohammed told the emergency operator align with the evidence police were about to uncover? From that moment on, the case was no longer simply about determining the cause of a woman's death at home. Investigators began scrutinizing every point in the timeline, every statement, every remaining trace of evidence. For that gap of over an hour before the emergency call offered no answers. Instead, it raised the first question. And the deeper they ventured into the house, the more reason the police had to suspect that what had happened to Joanne Samak was completely different from the story they had initially been told. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future true crime documentaries based on official case files, witness testimony, and verified evidence. Before the investigation began, we must return to the woman at the heart of this story. Joanne Jo Samak. She was 49 years old. But to her family and those close to her, Joanne is not defined by a number or by the events at Chestnut Spinney. They remember her character. Kind, thoughtful, loyal, generous, and creative. Joanne had a keen eye for beauty. She loved interior design, took an interest in fashion, found joy in art, and always held a deep affection for nature. These interests shaped Jo's world. An ordinary life that can easily fade from the narrative when a person's name becomes linked to a criminal case. Yet, the most important role in her life was within her family. Loved ones describe Jo as a wonderful mother who poured love and care into her children. And in late June 2024, she was looking ahead. Her 50th birthday was approaching. Get-togethers with friends were on the calendar. Plans were in place for the following day, just like any other ordinary day. According to evidence later presented in court by the prosecution, Joanne had already laid out her clothes for the morning. She had set her alarm. There were many plans waiting on the horizon. Each individual detail might seem unremarkable. An outfit, an alarm clock, an upcoming birthday, future appointments. Yet, following Joanne's death, these very ordinary details took on special significance for the investigation. They revealed how she was preparing for the day ahead and the months to come. More importantly, they stood in contrast to the explanation Mohammed Samak gave regarding what transpired inside the house in the early hours of that morning. Two distinct pictures began to emerge. One showed a Joanne preparing to move forward with her life. The other was a story told after her death. The gap between these two pictures would become one of the issues that the police, prosecutors, and ultimately the jury had to resolve. The person living with Joanne at the Chestnut Spinney home was her husband, Mohammed Samak. Mohammed was born in Egypt. Before his life became rooted in the UK, sports played a significant role in his career. He competed in hockey at the international level for Egypt before transitioning into coaching. On the surface, the public image presented nothing particularly suspicious: a former international athlete, a coach, a husband and father. The family lived in Droitwich Spa, in a residential area where daily life unfolded behind closed doors. But outward appearances rarely reveal the full story of what happens inside a home. By 2024, the marriage between Joanne and Mohammed was no longer as tranquil as it appeared to outsiders. Private issues began to drive a wedge between them. Tensions arose. The future of the relationship became uncertain. After Joanne's death, investigators began to examine this specific period. Not to speculate on the dynamics of the marriage, but to determine whether events prior to July 1st could help explain what occurred during her final hours. At the subsequent trial, the prosecution argued that Mohammed was facing significant personal pressures. The defense offered a different interpretation of events and denied the allegation that he had murdered his wife. Therefore, the goal was not to look back and frame every marital difficulty as a warning sign. What needed to be clarified was which pressures were actually substantiated by evidence, and how they related to the night Joanne died. The answer would not be found in images of Mohammed on the hockey field. It did not align with the way the Samak family had previously presented themselves to those around them. It began to surface when the police stepped through the door of Chestnut Spinney and delved deeper into what was actually transpiring behind that seemingly ordinary facade. For the gap between the outward image and the reality inside the home was steadily widening. When police began reviewing the final months of Joanne's life, they found no clear record of the kind of prolonged coercive control often seen in other domestic violence cases. There was no basis to infer behaviors such as stalking, monitoring of phone usage, or isolating Joanne from those around her. The details that emerged in court were more subtle, yet they revealed that the Samaks' marriage was entering a period of instability. The first crack: a shift in affection. Through the accounts of those close to Joanne, the jury learned how she viewed the marriage in the time leading up to her death. Joanne had confided in friends that the feelings between the couple were no longer what they used to be. This in itself was not evidence of a crime. Marriages can fracture for many reasons without ever leading to violence. However, for the investigation, this information helped establish the actual state of the relationship prior to the early hours of July 1st. The second crack:
Sandra Melgar's
money.
defense attorneys had tried
The prosecution presented another layer of pressure regarding finances. According to court testimony, the Samak family was facing financial difficulties, while Joanne played a significant role in the household income. This became part of the picture the prosecution used to explain the couple's circumstances. But financial hardship alone does not prove a motive for murder. It was merely one factor to be weighed alongside other evidence. The third crack: another woman. Phone data opened up a new line of inquiry. Information presented in court revealed that Mohammed had met and maintained contact with another woman. This detail could easily lead to a compelling narrative conclusion, but the evidence did not support going that far. The fact that Mohammed was in contact with another woman does not automatically prove an extramarital affair, let alone establish it as the cause of Joanne's death. The significance of this information can only be assessed within the context of the case file as a whole. The final rift: the prospect of the marriage ending. Based on testimony from friends, financial circumstances, and the gathered evidence, the prosecution argued that Mohammed had reason to believe his marriage might be coming to an end. It would ultimately be up to the jury to weigh the true significance of these factors. For at this stage, no single detail offered an explanation for what happened to Joanne. They merely revealed a family under greater strain than appeared on the surface. Then came the evening of June 30th, 2024. Just hours later, neighbors would hear screaming. A 999 call would be made, and Joanne would never walk out of the house at Chestnut Spinney again. In the Joanne Samek case, the prosecution did not offer a simple formula, such as claiming Mohammed killed Joanne for a single, solitary reason. The evidence did not allow for such a tidy narrative. Instead, the prosecution presented a series of circumstances that existed prior to the night Joanne died. A marriage that was fracturing, financial pressures weighing on the household, Mohammed's contact with another woman. At the same time, the prospect of Joanne leaving the marriage was becoming increasingly real. To the prosecution, these factors did not stand in isolation. They were pieced together to illustrate the context Mohammed was facing in the final days of June 2024. Yet, a clear distinction must be maintained. This was the prosecution's argument regarding motive, presented to the jury. It was not a confession from Mohammed, nor was it a psychological diagnosis that would allow us to state with certainty exactly what he was thinking or feeling. The defense had the right to challenge that interpretation and question the actual weight of each factor. Therefore, the decisive question of the case did not hinge on whether the prosecution could read Mohammed's mind. What mattered more was what could be verified. The timeline, neighbor testimony, the 999 call, traces found within the home, and a period of over an hour that still required explanation. For as the night of June 30th gave way to the early hours of July 1st, speculation began to yield to evidence. And it was those ensuing hours that became the true heart of the case. In the early hours of July 1st, 2024, Joanne and Mohammed were at their family home on Chestnut Spinney, Droitwich Spa. What transpired inside during the ensuing period was not captured on camera. There were no eyewitnesses in the room to recount the full sequence of events. Consequently, the subsequent investigation had to rely on externally verifiable details. And one of the most crucial details came from the neighbors. Amidst the quiet of the residential area in the early morning, they heard screaming. That sound would later become a significant marker in the timeline, for help was not summoned immediately afterward. Time ticked on. A few minutes, then longer, until the gap between what the neighbors heard and the emergency call exceeded an hour. After that interval, Mohammed called 999. According to his initial account, he had just discovered Joanne in a critical condition and believed she had inflicted the injuries upon herself. Emergency services were immediately dispatched to Chestnut Spinney. Police entered the house. Medics reached Joanne and administered necessary aid. But it was too late. The 49-year-old woman was pronounced dead at the scene. At this point, two conflicting accounts emerged. On one side was Mohammed's version of events regarding the discovery of his wife's condition. On the other was the testimony of nearby residents concerning the screaming heard more than an hour before the 999 call. That time gap did not automatically prove who was responsible for Joanne's death. But for the police, it raised a question that demanded an answer. What had happened during that time? Investigators must now examine statements, communication data, traces found at the house, and forensic results to establish the actual sequence of events. For if Mohammed had simply discovered his wife as the initial story claimed, why do the events leading up to the emergency call suggest a far more complex timeline? Mohammed Samek did not vanish from Droitwich Spa. nor did he flee after Joanne's death. What drew the police's attention lay elsewhere. It was the story of what had happened inside Chestnut Spinney. In the initial emergency call, Mohammed stated that Joanne had inflicted injuries upon herself. If that version were accurate, the police's task would primarily be to determine the cause of death and examine the events leading up to the moment he discovered his wife. But as the questioning deepened, his account began to shift. Mohammed offered a more detailed version. He said he had woken up after hearing Joanne screaming. He then claimed to have witnessed his wife inflicting injuries on herself. This shift immediately raised an issue. He was no longer merely describing the discovery of the aftermath. He was placing himself as an eyewitness to the events themselves. And an unavoidable question arose. If Mohammed was present when Joanne was in distress, why did more than an hour elapse before the 999 call was made? He had to account for that period to the investigators. His accounts were cross-referenced with neighbors' statements, the timing of the emergency call, and other evidence gathered from the house. The Crown Prosecution Service later maintained that Mohammed had repeatedly lied about the sequence of events leading to Joanne's death. That was the prosecution's position. But in a murder investigation, suspicion alone is never enough. A changing story might prompt further police questioning. A gap in the timeline might make an initial account difficult to explain. Even an accumulation of inconsistencies does not automatically prove who caused the death. To bring the case before a jury, the police needed something that could be verified independently of Mohammed's account. They needed evidence. And when forensic results, digital data, and other traces were laid alongside the timeline, the direction of the investigation shifted completely. The initial hours following Joanne's death left police with more questions than answers. And the first detail they had to address was the timeline. Witness accounts from neighbors near Chestnut Spinney indicated that screaming had been heard coming from the house well before emergency services were called. That gap of over an hour was immediately compared against the account Mohammed provided. The two timelines did not easily align. Investigators, therefore, had to determine what might have occurred during that unaccounted-for period. Next came the verbal accounts. What Mohammed said during the initial emergency call was compared with the details he provided during interrogation. Initially, the story centered on Joanne having inflicted the injuries upon herself. Later, Mohammed claimed he had woken up to his wife screaming and then witnessed the incident unfold. This discrepancy did not prove a murder had taken place. However, it cast doubt on the credibility of his original account, necessitating verification through independent sources. Then came the matter of the phone. Digital devices can preserve details that human memory might fail to recall, or that a witness statement might omit. Timestamps of contact, phone calls, text messages, relationships existing outside the home. Through data analysis, police uncovered further information about Mohammed's private life, including the fact that he had been in contact with another woman. That detail was later included in the prosecution's case file. However, data only proves what is explicitly recorded. It does not allow for an automatic conclusion of an extramarital affair, let alone explain the cause of Joanne's death. While experts analyzed the devices, another line of inquiry led police to those who knew Joanne best. Friends spoke about the state of the marriage. They recounted things Joe had shared with them. More importantly, their statements indicated that she was still looking toward the future. A 50th birthday, plans to meet up, clothes laid out for the next day, an alarm clock set before bed. Tiny details began to take on significance when pieced together. They helped investigators test the hypothesis that Joanne had inflicted the fatal injuries upon herself.
She didn't testify.
But a timeline alone could not determine the cause of death. nor could the phone reveal exactly what transpired during those final minutes. Friends could describe Joanne as she was before that night, but they were not at Chestnut Spinney when the incident occurred. To verify the most crucial part of Mohammed's account, the police needed a different source of evidence. A source independent of memory, independent of explanations, and independent of speculation regarding the marriage. The question now became very specific. Did Joanne's injuries truly align with Mohammed's account of how they occurred? The answer had to come from forensics. By this point, the police had established a suspicious timeline. They had accounts that were not entirely consistent. They had phone data and statements from those close to Joanne. But to determine whether Mohammed's story held water, investigators needed to return to the most crucial element: physical evidence. Blow 1. Medical evidence. Experts examined the nature of the injuries recorded on Joanne. This was a critical point, because Mohammed had offered a specific explanation: that Joanne had inflicted the injuries upon herself. If that version were accurate, the medical findings would have to align with the mechanism he described. The prosecution argued that they did not. In court, medical evidence was used to refute the hypothesis that all of Joanne's injuries could be explained by her husband's account. This was no longer merely a matter of Mohammed misremembering a timeline. Now, Joanne's own body provided information that the prosecution claimed contradicted his story. The initial explanation began to lose its footing. Blow 2. Clothing in the attic. Then, another piece of evidence emerged. During the search of the house, blood-stained clothing belonging to Joanne was found stored in the attic. Their location immediately raised questions. Why were items directly linked to Joanne found there? When were they taken up to the attic? And more importantly, who had placed them there? One should not speculate beyond what the evidence proves, but for the prosecution, the location of these clothes was a key element in reconstructing the events that took place inside Chestnut Spinney. That piece of evidence would go on to play a significant role when the case returned to the courtroom. Blow number 3. A timeline pieced together from multiple sources. Not every piece of evidence in the case was subjected to microscopic scrutiny. Part of the case's weight came from the way independent sources of information began to converge. Neighbors recalled hearing shouting. A 999 call provided another reference point. Interviews recorded the various accounts Mohammed gave. Phone records revealed further contacts and activities leading up to Joanne's death. Friends spoke about the state of the marriage, Jo's plans for the following day, her upcoming birthday, and her future helped provide context for her life prior to that fateful dawn. No single element, on its
Sandra
own,
Melgar's
could
defense
tell the whole
attorneys
story.
had tried to portray the
But
murder
when arranged in
investigation as
sequence,
seriously
the
flawed.
prosecution argued,
But
a different picture began to emerge. A picture inconsistent with the explanation that Joanne had simply inflicted the injuries upon herself before Mohammed discovered the situation. That was how the case was built. It did not rely on a confession. It did not depend on a single witness. Instead, it involved placing medical findings, physical evidence, digital data, testimony, and the timeline side by side to see if they all pointed to the same conclusion. Ultimately, that evidence was sufficient to bring the charges before a jury. Yet, entering the courtroom did not mean the case had reached its conclusion. For Joanne Samek's story would undergo not just one, but 2 trials before a final verdict was reached. The Joanne Samek case returned to Worcester Crown Court. This time, a new jury would have to reconsider the question the first trial had failed to resolve. How did Joanne die? And was Mohammed Samek responsible? The retrial lasted approximately 5 weeks. The prosecution did not build its case around a single piece of evidence. Instead, they asked the jury to look at the big picture, Forensic findings were weighed against the explanations given for Joanne's injuries. The timeline of the screaming was cross-referenced with the moment the 999 call was made. Testimony from neighbors and friends filled in the events leading up to the early hours of that morning. Phone data provided further information regarding Mohammed's contacts. The varying accounts he had given were examined alongside physical evidence recovered from Chestnut Spinney. Blood-stained clothing belonging to Joanne, found in the loft, also became part of the case file. Finally, there was the context of the marriage and the financial difficulties the prosecution argued were linked to a motive. No single element was presented as the complete answer. The prosecution's argument rested on the connections between them. The defense challenged that interpretation. Mohammed continued to deny the murder charge. He maintained his explanation that Joanne had inflicted the injuries upon herself and denied responsibility for his wife's death. Ultimately, the decision once again lay with the jury. On October 29, 2025, after reviewing the evidence from both sides, they returned to the courtroom with a verdict. This time, there was no hung jury. Mohammed Samak was found guilty of murder. 2 days later, on October 31st, he returned to Worcester Crown Court for sentencing. The judge imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years. After accounting for time already spent in custody, West Mercia police stated that he must serve a minimum of approximately 19 years and 8 months before becoming eligible for parole consideration. This does not mean he will be automatically released once the minimum term expires. Under the life sentencing framework in England and Wales, release can only be considered after the minimum term has been served and is subject to a formal legal assessment. A verdict has finally been reached in the criminal case. Only one person was convicted in connection with the death of Joanne Samak, Mohammed Samak. But if the story were to end with the husband's sentencing, we would overlook the most important person in the entire case, Joanne. At this point, the story need not dwell any longer on Mohammed Samak. Let us return to Joanne. To those who knew her, the name Jo was never defined merely by a murder case file at Worcester Crown Court. The memories they cherish are of a different nature entirely. The kindness she showed to everyone, her loyalty to those close to her, the generosity that marked her everyday life, her creativity expressed through a passion for design, art, and fashion, and the joyful energy Jo brought to those around her.
Sandra Melgar's defense
Nature,
attorneys had tried
too,
to portray
held
the
a
murder
special place in
investigation
her
as
world.
seriously flawed.
Yet,
But
above
perhaps their
all
most
these
persuasive
interests
argument-
and traits stood her most important role. Joanne was a mother. In the tributes paid by her loved ones, her love for her children was always at the heart of her life. The early hours of July 1st, 2024, stole away everything that lay ahead. The 50th birthday Jo never got to celebrate, the gatherings with friends that never took place, the plans that remained on the calendar, the moments with her children that no one imagined would come to such an abrupt end. An alarm clock, once set for the following morning, now carries a completely different meaning. It serves as a reminder that before Chestnut Spinney became a crime scene, Joanne was preparing to wake up and start her day just like anyone else. In October 2025, the justice system delivered its verdict regarding criminal responsibility for her death. The jury reached a decision. The court handed down a sentence. The legal proceedings may have concluded there, but the grief of those left behind does not follow a courtroom schedule. Jo's children must still grow
Sandra
up without
Melgar's
their
defense
mother's
attorneys
presence.
had tried to portray
For
the murder
friends,
investigation
only
as
memories
seriously
remain
flawed.
of the plans
But
they once
perhaps their
intended to
most
carry out
persuasive
together.
argument was Sandra herself.
Loved ones
She
must
didn't
learn to
testify.
move forward with a void that no court verdict can ever fill. And so, when looking back at this case, perhaps the most memorable aspect is not the house at Chestnut Spinney, not the 5-week trial, nor the life sentence. It is Joanne "Jo" Samak, and the life, relationships, joys, and future that once belonged to her. For before becoming the victim of a murder, Joanne lived a life worthy of being remembered for who she truly was. A story can be told in many ways. Testimony can shift. Memories can be imprecise. Gaps of a few hours may seem impossible to reconstruct. Yet, evidence is not judged by a single, isolated detail. When timelines are cross-referenced with witness accounts, data is weighed against forensic findings, and explanations are tested against physical evidence, the picture gradually comes into focus. In the case of Joanne Samak, the jury ultimately reached a verdict after 2 trials, finding Mohammed Samak guilty of murder. But a case should not be defined solely by the name of the convicted, the length of the prison sentence, or the evidence presented in the courtroom. At the heart of it all remains Joanne, a life filled with family, friends, hobbies, plans, and a future she was preparing to embrace. Justice can assign accountability for what happened in the past, but behind every homicide case file lies a future, a life the victim should have been able to live.